Prelude. The happiness of men is fragile, for so are we made that all our gains carry within them the seeds of loss, and too often we ourselves may sow them. After the events chronicled in the Book of the Helm, many long years of such happiness awaited Elof and Kara, whom he loved, and the friends they had won. And for all he knew, in the pride and prime of his years, they might have lasted forever. But it was he himself who was to end them, in such folly as only wise men may create, and endure terrible trials in consequence. Yet from that ill sowing much else was to grow, and of that the Book of the Armring tells. Chapter 1. The Forging. It was her restlessness that roused him, the slender body beside him twisting and turning beneath the covers of heavy tapestry, admitting the keen morning air to play over his naked skin. For a moment he lay half drugged with sleep, dimly aware of a deeper chill growing within him. He knew it well, that chill, all too well of late. In part it was excitement, oddly tinged with guilt. But even more of it was fear. In sleepy anxiety he rolled over, put out an arm to enfold her, brushed her flank as she rose, and dropped on the warmth of the empty sheet. His eyes blinked open. She was stepping onto the balcony, her skin pale as the dawn sky beyond, lifting something to her shoulders. A swirl of white hit her back, fell back to her sides, its lining black as her hair. Then her outstretched arms raised the cloak in a great spreading sweep, hiding the sky. Fear stabbed him awake. He sat up, cried out. Her arms dropped, but in falling the cloak billowed out, the lining flashed, and the air whistled with the downstroke of wide black wings. A great swan surged up from the balcony and wheeled dark against the pallid airs, lifting and swooping with a lazy grace out over the sleeping rooftops and down towards the sea. He cursed and sprang from the bed, his feet tangling in the spread skins beneath, and flung aside the curtain of the aumbry behind. From its highest shelf he seized a light metal cap and clapped it onto his head. A spray of mail fell icy about his cheeks, chilled his neck as he closed it with clumsy fingers. Fear flamed in him. Fear and a fire still hotter. So it was, as the tale is told, that there awoke in his heart that wish, wholly loving and yet tainted by darker and more ruthless desires, that was to turn the course and flow not of his brief existence alone, but of the whole winter of the world. He drew breath an instant, forced himself to think, while the black speck dwindled in the swelling light. An image formed in his mind. He gave it substance, shape, and as it burgeoned, a wave washed over him, a prickling surge of pain, cold and metallic, that trailed behind it a sense of vast pressures. He let fall his hands, and felt the air grow thick beneath them, a sudden urge of overwhelming power at his breast that lifted him high, higher, across the tangled bed and out over the balcony in a single thrusting embrace of the air. His legs trailed. He angled his feet in the rush to steady him as he rose. His eyes, grown newly keen, sought out the distant wing beats. Already they were out beyond the harbor. With a fierce, voiceless hiss, he angled his wings and plunged down the sky in pursuit. Below him the ships of the great fleet rocked gently at their moorings, no one stirring on their decks, and at the sight of them a cool thread of doubt grew among Elof's anger. He threw all his strength into his wings, arced high above the seawall and out over the swell that heaved like the breathing of some vast monster, low but deep. Over it, now low, now high, sped Kara. But for all her speed, he was gaining. He was upon her. The shadow of his wings flickered on her back as he stooped to her. She wheeled effortlessly and rose to meet him. Level with him she flew, and passed so close that her back brushed his breast, and their flight muscles rippled together under the sleek black down. Her neck snaked against his, writhing teasingly. Then, suddenly, down ruffled against bare skin, her skin. Up and past him she surged, in woman's shape once more. But from her shoulders vast black wings still beat, and among their feathers was a single flash of gold. Startled, he threshed clumsily after her, and her laughter rang bright in his ears. He struggled to concentrate, to clothe himself in a new shape as she had, but he could not imagine himself so, could not accept the strangeness of it. He faltered, fluttered on the freshening wind, panicked, and felt the shape that masked him fall away, the rushing air chill upon his naked skin. He flailed at emptiness and dropped like a stone. The uprush took him, flung him about, showed him the steely sea sweeping up to meet him. Then it whipped him around again, and Kara filled the sky, swooping down upon him, a vision of eerie loveliness. He reached his arms out to her, and her great wings closed about him, enveloped him. He touched her, clung, and felt her legs twine around him. Her lips pressed down on his with bruising force. Her tongue flickered against his, and her breasts thrust against him with every wing beat. He hooked an arm about her heaving shoulders, caressed her with his free hand, felt the taut peak of her fierce excitement, the heart that leaped beneath. He stroked his fingers down her ribs to her flank, across her taut belly, and she threw back her head and cried out. They were rising now, the sea swaying away beneath them with every beat of the black pinions, faster and faster. He felt a surge of strength to match her own, and crushed her to him. Her back arched, her legs quivered against his. Then she folded fiercely forward and crossed them about his waist. Joined, they scaled the heights of the sky, while beneath them the horizon rolled away to reveal the sun, and they lifted into its first clear flare of gold. It blazed on Kara's pale skin as she swayed back in a tremor of delight, and to Elof's eyes she seemed to flow with a flood of molten light. It spilled over into him, rushed searing through his body, a torrent that burst into his mind and blotted out thought. He felt Kara stiffen convulsively against him, her wide wings outthrust, quivering. With the high scream of a great bird, she toppled backward in the air. They went spiraling down into emptiness, uncaring. Only in the last instant, as the sea seemed to reach up and grab at them, did Elof recover his wits. Kara gave a wild yell, then he felt a great stinging slap of cold across his back that all but drove out what little breath was left him. Water rushed into his open mouth, stung his eyes, roared in his ears. It sucked the heat from him, though his skin burned with the impact. Instinctively, he kicked out against the icy embrace, felt himself rising, and in a sudden qualm of panic, snatched for the precious helm. His fingers touched metal, and he knew it hung still fastened about his neck. It was no greater relief when an instant later he burst through the surface and could draw breath. Gasping, he clawed his streaming hair out of his eyes. A wave lifted him, and he looked anxiously about. He was floating naked in a strong swell, the shore no more than a sun-reddened streak of gray in the distance, and he could see no other shape among the wave crests. Then came a splash, and Kara's light laughter rippled like harp strings among the soft rush and thunder of the ocean. Two warm and wholly human arms slithered around his neck, and her slender body was a startling warmth in the dawn-chilled waters. Kara, you! Then he had to hold her close and kiss her, taste the salt on her soft neck. Her dark eyes sparkled into his, and he sought to see past the gentle mockery he read there, and heard in her voice. But you were not worried, surely? For me? Who in all the world has less to fear from any element than I? He held her to him, tight, as if at any moment she might slip away into the depths beneath. I was afraid you might have changed again, gone where I could not follow. She stroked his forehead. Why would I do that, my heart, even if I could? Have you not bested me before, you and your cunning helm? Aye, but it strains me, Kara. I was not born to this constant shifting and change, and I love you as you are. I would have you so. She lowered her eyes and smiled a small smile. And did you not just? In what counts, at any rate. Elof laughed, though it rang hollow in the emptiness within, and bent his head to hers. That I'll grant you. Though the rest was strange enough. In all conscience, it was good. But I'm wearied now, and the ocean's ice chill yet at this hour. Let's be swimming back for breakfast, huh? She threw up her arms above her head, as if about to dive. Her serpentine gold arm ring flashed warmly in the sunlight. Gladly. In what? As ourselves, Kara. Please. She pulled free of his arms, rolled idly on her back in the water, and let a wave crest bear her along. If we must. Then suddenly her long legs thrashed, sprayed water in his face, and she was torpedoing off through the waves, almost as fast, it seemed, as in any unhuman form. Elof groaned and launched himself after her. He was a powerful swimmer, but a graceless one, and in another moment she was rolling and plunging about him like the dolphin she could be, tickling him, nipping him, tangling his thrashing legs, or simply brushing herself against him and darting out of reach. And that he found most disturbing of all. She was seldom so skittish, and unease swelled in him. All right, he protested, coming to a halt and treading water. Have it as you will. Match me now. He reached up and pulled the helm over his head once more and ducked down. Side by side, twisting in the first shaft of sunlight, two seals arrowed towards the coast. But it was in human form that the two clambered onto the warm stones of the sea-wall and stood dripping a moment. Well, laughed Kara, leaning on Elof's shoulder and clutching her swan cloak about her. May I shape-shift once more, or would you have us stride through the streets as we are? We've scandalized the night watch enough already, I doubt not. Shift, and I'll follow. Kara, already in swan's shape once more, chose to hear that as a challenge. Rather than flying straight home, she led him on a lively dance around and about the forests of masts, diving and weaving among the tangles of rigging with a leisurely grace that was wholly deceptive. Plunging after her between trailing clumps of blocks and tackle that every moment threatened to snare a wing and send him spinning down to the deck or sea, Elof felt the terrible sinking of doubt grow ever greater in him. Soon, very soon now, this great fleet must take to the sea, sailing southward as they had every spring these 7 years past, on a great voyage south and east, making landfall upon the barren coasts of the inland seas. From there, The king and his crews would retrace the way overland through the borderlands of the hostile wastes to the fair coasts of the west, the road by which, 1,000 years past, Vade had led the last comers from Morven to the land of Bryhane in the west. There they would help to hold off the advancing Equesh marauders for another summer, and at its end, as the raiders retreated for the winter, bear back with them still more of Kerberhein's unhappy people. And with the fleet, as in every one of those 7 springs, Elof and Kara would go. Long and arduous that way would be, yet it was none of the many perils of the wild that awoke such unease in Elof's heart. To the menaces of the forest realm, Tapaiola on Aethan, they were as nothing. And though he had already passed and bested the will of its shadowy lord, it is the perils we bear with us that I fear. By the time he landed upon the high balcony of the palace, Kara was already shaking the seawater from her swan cloak, whirling it this way and that in a rain of droplets. There! And what, pray you, was so terrible about that? Nothing, said Elof somberly, as well you know. And yet... Kara's dark eyes seemed to narrow further. And yet, she echoed, and her arms fell to her sides. It happens ever more of late. You grow restless. The fit falls on you of a sudden, and you are gone. By strange ways, in strange forms. You are often hard to follow. Not by design. Are you not as apt as I am at the sport? You proved that long ago. Perhaps, though it is natural to you. Other shapes are but masks to me. They soon gall. But is it any longer a sport, Kara? She stared at him, bewildered. Why? Why indeed, Kara? What is it stirs in you, calls you so? The spring, perhaps. Nothing more? No other behest, no other voice, nothing that would summon you away from me? No. From you? Her arms went out to him, and hearing the hurt in her voice, he could only take them, hold her to him. What could ever be strong enough to do that? He shook his head. Then what is it, Kara, my love? For there is something. I would swear it. In the palace towers above, bells chimed, sounding the first hour of the day, and she pulled away from him, laughing again. What a mood for so fine a morning! Come, dress if you are so set on your breakfast. Other bells were echoing the hour from the city below, an instant apart, so that the peals rang together, but not as one. Elof, struggling into tunic and hose, watched Kara flow into her gown with liquid grace. Even so it is with us, he thought. But as he followed her out onto one of the open galleries that circled the palace like a coronet, he said no more, only listened intently to the music of the bells. Many who knew intimately could distinguish their individual tones clear among the clangor. Good chimes, well-pitched, ringing brightly without crack or flaw. Those bells he had cast himself, making good the destructions of the Equesh occupation. He knew every stage of their making, from the alloying to the final raising. He could trust them. Then he grew wroth with himself for what that thought implied, whether about Kara or others. His trust was not so narrow as that. He had friends enough who had risked their lives with him, for him, and for whom he had done the same, or would gladly. those bonds were of nothing so fragile as metal, nor so easily forged. Then why think worse of Kara? A gleam of gold caught his eye, and for all the warmth of the sunlight he went cold. He had shaped her that arm ring. That was why. The ring and all that went with it. Without those virtues, those patterned forces in the gold. Once, a lonely, desperate youth, he had pressed it on her. She had taken it, in sympathy perhaps, and suppose she had not. What would he be to her then? He bit his lips savagely. But then she turned and laughed, warmer than gold or sunlight, and tucked her strong, slim arm in his, pressing closer to his side, and he could resist her no more. He hugged her close, and they made their way thus down the long stairs to the lower galleries. The cold core of doubt and fear within him seemed to melt and dwindle, yet, tempered and hardened by fear of loss, some tiny sliver still remained. Under the new kingship and the restored peace, the great halls of the palace of Morvenhall, through which they walked, were flourishing as they never had before the Equesh came. There was not one of that fierce folk now left alive east of the mountains, so far as any could tell. In a swift and bloody week, the land had been scoured of them, and of those others, shadowy followers of the ice-worshipper Brihon, who had guided and prepared their invasion. Freed from the Equesh, the Eastlands had begun to grow and flourish once again. From the day he took possession of his halls, the new king had made his first priority the feeding of his folk, organizing the fair sharing of what supplies there were, and the urgent clearing and planting of land that had been left fallow and overgrown for many years. But even as the first planting was ending, he was setting out with what ships and men the land could afford for the Westlands, and for Kerberheim, the city that 2 years since had all but driven him out. He found it in a very different mood, harried by famine and disease, the power of the syndicacy in tatters. It might have been in total anarchy, save that the threat of the Equesh had grown so great there that internal differences had come to seem light by comparison, and perhaps also the death of Brihon had led to a lessening of the strife. Ironically enough, it was the Norderney fugitives the syndics had once sought to bar who had become the staunchest supporters of order and the fiercest fighters against the invading Reavers. But they were not enough. Slowly but surely, the lands of the great landowners were being overrun, and their peasants were fleeing within the walls of the city, reducing the flow of its food supply even as they increased the demands on it. The prospect of an eastern realm which neither Equesh nor ice could easily reach, with a diminished population and land to spare, became suddenly appealing even to those landowners, and to those partisans of the Briheren faction who had long opposed the line of Morven. When under Kermorven's generalship a mingled force of men of Norderney, Kerberheim, and Morvenhall decimated or drove out all the larger bands of marauders, all opposition fell strangely silent, and many who had most fiercely opposed the kingship became most vocal in seeking its shelter. More sought to go with Kermorven than he could possibly take. He promised a return for them, and this promise he had kept. That first fleet sailed back in time to help with a harvest of unlooked-for abundance, and from that day forth it became only a matter of time until the West was abandoned. That time drew nearer with every passing year. During those years, the palace saw many rich and splendid feasts, commanded by the king as token of its reborn prosperity, or to welcome unhappy refugees from the Westlands. But at the first meal of the day there was no pomp or luxury. Lord and servant ate together if they chose. The fare was simple, the mood quiet and relaxed in preparation for the labors of the day ahead. In this it reflected the nature of the king himself. As often at this hour, he had forsaken his high table and ate at his ease out on the gallery, contemplating the harbor and the muster of his fleet. His lean frame was wrapped in a light robe. His bronzen hair was unkempt. He wore plain, rope-soled seaman's sandals and seemed wholly at peace with himself and the world. When he saw Elof and Kara approaching, he rose at once, smiling, and greeted them with his usual slightly stiff good nature. "My master, my lady, come and grace my table. I'm glad to see you so early, Elof. Much must be settled today ere the shipyards can begin their labors, and with ills away, our wisest smith should advise me." Kara laughed. "Then you will excuse me, will you not, my Lord Charon? And you, Elof? You know such matters have little hold upon my mind. I'll breakfast with our friends within." She kissed Elof lightly and glided down the steps into the cool depths of the halls. The men watched her go. Elof, a little ruefully. Kermorven smiled. "She adorns our halls. It is good to see that you and she have still your share of the happiness we have found." Elof slumped down into a chair so hard that its light frame protested. "Do we?" Kermorven sat down more slowly, and his misty blue gaze grew suddenly piercing. "A tale reached me but moments since," he remarked with dry disapproval. "A wild tale, such as the watcher wont to dream up at a dull night's ending." Elof groaned faintly. Then the king's stern features were suddenly illuminated by a mischievous twinkle. "I can only say that you both looked remarkably fresh. And well, I'm no authority. I think it is hardly so that love lessons." Elof felt his scowl harden. "Our love? No. But—" He hesitated, but his need to speak, to mold words out of his inner blackness, was too great. "It is our trust I fear for, and Kara's safety. Kermorven, she was seeking to escape me. I'm sure of it." Kermorven sat up, startled. "Escape you? Talk sense, man." "I mean it. She changed, flew. I woke and followed. But if I had not woken, what then? What then? How far would she have flown? And where? To whom? Kermorven, there is another voice calls her. Of that I am sure."
"Another voice?"
Kermorven's face darkened once again, and his voice took on an edge that belied its quietness.
"She who mastered her of old, you mean? Yes, that would not surprise me. Inevitable that Louhi would try to summon her back. The Lady of the Ice is hardly one to forgive or forget. Were the thing snatched from her less precious, or less loved?"
Elof heard himself blurt out, and the bitterness lay like metal on his tongue. Kermorven inclined his head sympathetically, yet a little distantly, as if to set himself apart from Elof's jealousy.
"What of that? It is past. Whom Kara loves, that is what matters. That is what must counter the call. That, strengthened by your love, your trust."
Elof flushed. That alone was never enough to win her free of Louhi. Not even though she had my arm ring, with all the virtues I set upon it.
"Not while you were apart, but from the moment she saw you once more, she began to struggle. You called upon that ring, and she triumphed.
Aye, for a moment. Then I had to hunt her down.
It was the moment that mattered, said Kermorvan sharply. That set you free, to free her. Do you remember? I was there. I saw.
He stroked his chin thoughtfully.
And that was when you hardly knew one another, when she could scarcely believe your love was possible. Now you have had years together, happy years. The links will be stronger.
But strong enough? Blazed Elof. Dare I trust her? For her own sake?
If they are not strong enough, then seeking to tighten her bonds may only weaken them further.
Kermorvan smiled thinly.
Even I can see that, little versed as I am in matters of the heart. If you doubt her strength, lend her your own. Do not force it upon her. Have patience. Wait. There lies the best counsel I can give you. That, don't forget your food.
He gestured to the table at his side, which held dishes of smoked meat, cornbread, curds, and fruit.
Now, about the Alavin's refit. The shipwrights report that the old tackle will not bear the new rig. We cannot rely on Ills returning in time, and other than she, only you truly understand ship work.
For the next hour, Kermorvan kept Elof so busy discussing shipyard problems that he should have had no time to think of anything else. And perhaps that was in part his purpose. But instead, Elof found himself answering and eating in a kind of abstracted daze, while the core of his mind wandered along other paths. He heard his own voice as if it was another's, though it spoke sense enough, while through his inner self fears and worries stalked. He found himself longing for Kara to return, constantly fighting down the urge to run and find her, to be sure she had not somehow vanished away once more. When he heard her laughter, soft and bright as fine gold, echo unmistakably out of the shadows of the hall, he felt his whole being relax in reassurance. Yet only minutes later, he was anxious again. Wait, he told himself sarcastically. Have patience. That was not the turn of a smith's mind. They could be patient only in action, not inaction. No more was it their way to leave weak links lying. They would sooner forge the whole chain anew. All throughout that day, it was that vision that haunted his thoughts, of a chain stretched to breaking. How he got through the many tasks that devolved upon the court smith and chiefest counselor of so active a king, he never knew. For Kara was ever in his mind. Kara, whom he loved too well to risk losing once again. Yet somehow it was evening, and he came to the door of their chambers in the palace, those high rooms where Kara's chains had been broken, and they had first become lovers. A great weariness was upon him, and a need for comfort, and the sight of Kara, reclining upon a daybed on the balcony, was balm to his tormented heart. She sat there in silent silhouette, contemplating a sunset of eggshell greens and blues beneath a canopy of clouds streaked fiercely red and gold. And when he approached her, she did not turn, but waved him to the couch beside her. He stooped to kiss her, then stopped as he saw tracks of fire upon her cheeks, as though the angry clouds wept, and not she. She looked up sharply into his face and began to speak, then hesitated. You asked me earlier if there was any other voice that called me, that sought to part me from you, and I denied it. But, heart, You were right. For a moment, he felt a vast sinking away beneath him, and then a sudden recovery. At least she was admitting it. He would help her now. Yes, it's that she-wolf Louhi, isn't it? Kara gave a short, bitter laugh and gestured dismissively. Her? Oh, yes, she is always there, far off, whispering, tugging. But I had almost ceased to think of her. This is something more, a thing hard to understand, something I cannot know for certain. Yet with every fiber of my being, I sense it. A great change coming, a balance swaying this way and that, and whichever way it tips must alter the world. She turned and leaned on the low railing of the balcony, gazing out at the sea. The wind had turned westerly now, by the gilded vanes on the high roofs below, and it was driving gray breakers in against seawall and shore, booming upon block and gravel. Above them flocked gulls, bright in the last of the light, and their harsh cries awoke new fear in his heart, that at any moment she might fly up from him and be lost in their numberless throngs. A wave rises over all things. Oh, a wave rises over all things, and soon it will break. Much that is new must flow in. Much that is old must be swept away. And I am old, heart, very old. Elof caressed her crisp, dark curls, stroked her smooth cheek. You are no older than when first I set eyes upon you, and you have little memory of the years, you have said. Little, till first I came into bondage, till first I set eyes upon you. Elof frowned. Are the two, then, so close? Only in time. You do not bind me. I am not your property, your instrument and plaything, as I was hers. Once I roamed the world uncaring, unremembering, save when I served the steerers in war, and that too was in my nature from the first. So to be held again, save by my own will, by myself, even to think of that sickens me. But with you, I am happy. As before? As when you were free? She gazed around at him, her green eyes wide with astonishment. But surely, why else should I stay? Elof nodded. Why, indeed? But this change you sense, it comes soon, you feel? The sun rolled beneath the horizon, and all things beyond the balcony, tree, rooftop, cliff, darkened to shapes of shadow against the sky, golden now as peach skin, shot with gray clouds. She smiled. Soon need not be as men conceive it. Then she looked away again. And a day may come when I would welcome it, embrace it. Having known you, I cannot ever be the same. Elof knew what she meant. In all the years he had loved her, she had not aged, nor would she, perhaps, within the circles of the world. Whereas he would share the common lot of men. But he had accepted that, for himself, with an ease that surprised him. Was it selfishness that he so seldom thought what it would mean to her? But suppose it did come soon, he persisted. Soon as I would see it, I mean. Would you resist it, then, and stay with me? Could you? I don't know, she breathed. How can I know? Were the choice mine, yes, my heart. I would try. I would strive. With all my being, I would. But Elof leaned over, gripped her bare arms, gazed deep into her eyes that had the shade of a forest pool, the alert gaze of deer that drank there. Do you fear you cannot resist, heart? That you lack the fortitude? The strength? Let me help you. Join my strength to yours. How may I do that? How can you help? I will study. I will seek. It would not be the first time I managed what a power could not. I need time, Kara. Time. You must trust me. Give me that time. Hold yourself as safe meanwhile as you know how. She flashed him a sudden, uncertain glance. What do you mean? I mean, rein in your urge to change. It is that betrays you. Hold your human form. Cease to shift and wander through the world, save at great need. For now, only for now. She turned her head away indignantly, and he heard her voice go very cold. I trust you. Or I trust you when you say you love me and do not want to part. I need no proof. But in trusting me this, for now, only for now, you will be showing me how strong that love, that wish could be. Her teeth gleamed white, biting hard against her lower lip. I would promise, gladly I would, she cried out, desperate. But dare I? Can I? Have I the strength? You cannot imagine how strong is the urge. I can, he said softly, if only by the pain it causes you. But you have the power to see that you never break your promise by one simple act. Give me your swan cloak that you need to take on new forms. Give it me, and I shall lock it in my strongest chest, returning it to you only at need. Believe me, he added, to forestall her cry of protest. I guess how great a trust that would be. But for now, at least, we have no better answer, and no way to find one. Take time to think, if you wish. But at once she rose, and from the seat beside her she plucked the cloak, swirling it around her shoulders. But instead she folded it carefully, neatly, and held it tight to her breast a moment, burying her face in the down. Then impetuously she thrust it into Elof's hands. It hung there lightly, like a sliver of cloud. He lowered his eyes and turned away into the inner chambers, where stood several chests, some metal-bound, some wholly of metal. It was to a large one he turned, and with a small key and some murmured words, he unlocked the lid and laid the cloak reverently upon the piles of cloth-wrapped volumes within, shifting some of the bright jewels aside so that there was no chance of any snagging. He closed the lid again with more words upon it, and went back to the balcony. There stood Kara still, gazing out into emptiness, her shoulders bowed and her arms crossed, hugging her breast, as against a chill. He laid his hands upon her shoulders, very gently, meaning to slide his arms down to embrace her. But she whirled around, gazing into his face with eyes large and liquid. Hold me, she whispered. Hold me, for the world grows dark. Let us live. Let us seize love and joy while we can. He felt her arms suddenly cold under his fingers, and he held her tight, let his mantle fall around her, covering her from the onrushing night. I will hold you, he whispered. But even now, I can do more, Kara, if you will let me. can shield you.
No! You would forge your love into a cage.
He knew well what was in her thoughts, how she had wept with rage at her first sight of caged songbirds in the city markets. Before the day's end, Kermorven, not easily swayed on any matter, had found himself forbidding the practice altogether. She shook her head insistently.
You would temper bars for me to flutter against, till at last I grew weary, ceased to care, and shattered them altogether. We must find some other way. I would not be pinioned ever again, love, by any force save one, and that is myself.
He looked into her intent eyes, on a level with his own, and ran his hand through her dark hair. And even as he did so, a cold thought came into his mind, and there took root. So be it, he said quietly, and bent to kiss her on the brow.